There are fresh concerns about the role of some Chinese organisations and figures in Australia, prompting the Attorney-General's Department to issue advice to the Albanese government about problems with the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. For more on this, joining us live is Will Glasgow. He's the North Asia correspondent at the Australian newspaper. Will, you wrote about this today. Just explain for us what challenges have been raised. What are the gaps here that have been identified?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few, actually. So this is all about the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, which was created by the Turnbull government in 2018, so about 5 years ago. And, it's having some troubles, right? It's having trouble. It's a voluntary scheme, right? So you opt onto it. You declare yourself as an entity that's got foreign relations or links to a foreign government. And what the problem is, and what Attorney Generals has made very clear, is that entities that are associated with governments where information is not really shared, secretive governments, they don't say China, but governments like China, like Russia, North Korea, but it's not a big, doesn't have a big presence in Australia. But yeah, entities associated with those countries are being very reluctant to engage with this register. And look, the report that Amanda Hodge and myself have done in the Australian this week's on a group, the Australian Economic and Cultural Associations, a group based in Sydney. Now, it's not accusing anything wrong with that group. It's just noting it's not on the Foreign Influence Register, and it's got clear links to the Chinese government. The Australian government's aware that groups like that, if there's going to be a foreign influence scheme, they should be on there, it would seem, but they don't quite know how to do it, how to get them on there. At the moment, as I said, it's you put yourself on there. The only recourse the Australian government has at the moment is to move criminal procedures if someone's not cooperating with the legislation. So one of the things the Attorney General's Department's recommended is to give a greater range of enforcement powers. So instead of going, nuclear to the criminal procedures, criminal proceedings, they've suggested, name and shame or publicly out entities that aren't complying with them, or you could issue an infringement, a penalty, something well below criminal charges, but something that makes it public and on the record that these entities aren't cooperating.
Yeah, you can understand that the government wouldn't want to go down that criminal path straight away because, look, as we all know, the politics at play over this issue in Australia are tricky. I mean, clearly this is a pretty tenuous time in our relationship with China, with the AUKUS deal on one hand and improving trade relations on the other. But what are the risks if transparency isn't successfully achieved through the register, do you think?
Well, I mean, look, I do. One of the key things to remember with this scheme and the focus on foreign interference and influence in Australia, I mean, the key point of this is to protect Australian democracy, civic life in Australia. The people who are most at risk of this not working, the people who suffer the most are Australia's Chinese heritage community, right? So, yeah, it's a sensitive time in the Australian-China relationship. Well, that's true. It was a sensitive time last year. It was a sensitive time every single year since this was introduced in 2018. It's not going to stop being a sensitive time next year, the year after that. I'll be amazed if I live in an age when it's not a sensitive time in the Australian-China relationship, right? So now we can choose not to have this conversation about what is foreign influence, what is foreign interference, how can we refine the scheme so it works better, how can we make it work to help Chinese Australians. Perhaps the politics is too hard, perhaps we will privilege trade, but we need to be aware the risk of that is we're going to constrain the ability of Chinese Australians to live their lives as free as possible, as free as we could allow them to within Australia. So, these are the trade-offs we need to make. It's difficult, don't get me wrong. And I mean, I don't think the Albanese government wants to sit on this forever. They are reviewing this legislation. I mean, that was written into the legislation in 2018. They're in the process of doing that. Now, they don't want to talk about it at all publicly. I mean, on the phone yesterday, I've really had such silence or discomfort on the other end on a story as in this one. from everyone in the government I spoke to, right? They even backbenchers in the Labor Party do not want to touch this. They're under strict orders. Do not talk about China out of your portfolio. Unless you're the foreign minister, don't do it. Now, maybe that will change after a little bit after, or if Prime Minister Albanese goes to Beijing. Now they're hoping that'll be in October, November, and meets Xi Jinping. We'll see. We'll see about that. So I think if we hear more about this, if they get serious about improving it, and maybe they will be, maybe they just don't want to talk about it. But I think if that happens, it's the tinkering. I expect this to be the kind of story that comes out or is dripped out on Christmas Eve or, New Year's Eve. I think this is going to be, they'll be looking for a very dead media time to try to drop this. But, that's a bit of guessing on my work.